Hi everyone. In today's class we're going to take a look at evolution. In this video we will go over the basics of evolution, and we'll also look at the different pieces of evidence that will support evolution. Now, a lot of the times when we think about evolution, the other side to the story is always about the creationists. So I'm going to take a couple of minutes just to go over who the creationists are and what their beliefs are versus scientists who believe in evolution. So if you look at the spectrum of viewpoints, you have the hardcore creationists on the left, and then you have evolutionary supporters on the right. You and I probably fall somewhere in between the two. Okay, so if we look at the hardcore creationists, an example of someone who is a hardcore creationist is Ken Ham. He basically and his followers all believe that life on Earth is dictated by God. Okay, everything that's in the Bible is taken literally, word for word. So the whole story of Adam and Eve and all the animals and the Earth being created in 7 days, they believe that is absolutely true. So on the other side, we have evolutionary supporters, okay, people who believe in evolution and the science of it. They believe that life came to be, how life came to be, is still uncertain. Okay, there's very little that we can do to prove how life came to be, but life on Earth evolves over time. Okay, so they're saying something that's totally different. Okay, they're not saying, evolution explains how life is created. Evolution simply states that yes, there is life, and all the life that's there changes through time. Okay? Creationists often believe that species that exist today existed thousands of years ago. They remain pretty much unchanged. So an organism can grow, but species do not come from other species. Whereas in evolution, the idea that new species develop from earlier species is pretty much accepted. Now, the other aspect that we have to differentiate between the two is how old the Earth is. According to the creationists, the Earth is estimated to be anywhere between 7,000 to 10,000 years old. Okay, and this is basically based on their time frame from the source from the Bible. Now, scientists generally puts the Earth at 4.5 billion years old. Okay, and later on we'll realize why that length of time is important. Okay, a lot of things can happen in 4.5 billion years, whereas between 7 and 10,000, it's not likely to happen. Okay, so we'll kind of get into that a little bit later. Now, one of the biggest evolutionary supporters is, of course, Bill Nye. So these two, if you actually search them up on YouTube, okay, they have gone at it. Okay, they've had debates in terms of, evolutionary theory and creationism. So hopefully we'll get the chance to talk about them a little bit later. But for now, I want to look at the science of evolution. My job isn't to sway you towards one way or the other. Okay, my job is to basically give you the science, okay, the science facts, and then let yourself make the decision based on the facts. Now, there are some people that have very strong faith, okay, in whichever religion that they believe in, okay, and that's fine. Now, science often does come into direct conflict with some of those faiths, but most people do find a balance between the two. Okay, so let's start with the science. What is evolution? Now, the term evolution, this is I would say the scientific definition, okay, of what evolution is. Scientists define evolution as the change in allele frequency of a population's gene pool. Now, put into more common everyday terms, this basically just means how often does a specific gene appear or disappear in a collection of genes. Okay, so you guys should remember what alleles are. They're just different variations of a gene. So how often do those genes appear in the whole collection of genes in a species? Okay, if we can answer that, we're basically taking steps towards understanding what evolution is. The one important note that I have to make is evolution does not occur in individuals. So, Jenny cannot evolve into something more. Okay, it's not possible. However, if Jenny is human, okay, her species can evolve into something more, okay, or into at least something different. So, what can evolve? Well, from a biology standpoint, any living organism can evolve. But at the same time, we know that viruses are not living, but they evolve as well. Okay, so evolution basically just means change over time. Can something develop or change over a period of time? So if they can, then technically anything that changes over time can technically evolve. So let's look at the evolution of cell phones. Okay. The oldest type of cell phone is all the way over to the left here. Some of you probably don't recognize this. You may have seen one of these, okay, if your parents or grandparents had one. Okay. All of these cell phones here are probably before your time, okay, but their basic function and features and characteristics all seem very similar. However, as you go from left to right, okay, it becomes less analog and more digital. Okay, so they are changing gradually over time. Humans, of course, also evolve, okay, and it's said that we evolved from our primate ancestors. Now, in biology, when we're looking at evolution, we typically look at how a species evolve. Okay, and species is normally abbreviated as SPP. Now, just to remind you that a species is a group of similar organisms, okay, but they have to be able to reproduce, and they have to reproduce successfully. Okay, so you can't have any hybrids. So that's why most hybrids, they're the dead end of their evolutionary lineage, okay, because they cannot reproduce and pass on their genes to the next generation. So in order for an organism to be helpful to that species in its evolution, they have to be able to reproduce fertile offspring. Alright, so we're going to look at the evidence for evolution. We won't have time to look at the whole thing in this one video because there's about 5 pieces of evolution here. So we'll look at mostly just the first 2. So the first piece of evolution, or evidence of evolution, is the fossil record. We'll also take a look at comparative anatomy and physiology. And then in the next video, we'll look at embryological evidence, biochemical evidence, and then finally, biogeography. So the fossil record I won't spend too much time on, okay, but I do want to outline the importance of the fossil record in terms of being able to provide evidence to support evolution. So a fossil record, it gives us a timeline, a chronological timeline of how an organism have changed. Okay, so when I say how organisms have changed, I'm referring to the species. Okay. Now, fossils is more than just bones. Okay, and even when we're thinking about dinosaur bones as being fossils, they're not the actual bone from dinosaurs. They're actually just minerals that replaced the actual bony tissue. Okay, but there are more items that can be considered fossils than just bones. So fossils may include animal or plant imprints. Okay, so things like footprints, tracks. Okay, any kind of mold that their body has made is typically a fossil. Ice core samples can also be good fossils because they show us how the temperature of the planet has changed over time. Materials that have been deposited into sedimentary rock layers. Okay, this is our most common example of fossils. And then we also have tools. Okay, so if you can find different tools from different civilizations, right, these are basically used as fossils. Okay, so to give you a visual of these fossils, we have things like arrowheads, okay, which are considered tools. So any kind of tool that you might find in anything like pottery, sticks that have been carved, cave paintings as art, okay, those are all considered to be fossils because they give us evidence that there used to be some kind of civilization that came before our current civilization. Shark teeth are good fossils as well, so portions of an animal, or you can even have imprints of the entire organism, like in trilobites, for instance. Feces also make pretty good fossils. Okay, so if you have identified different types of feces, fossilized feces, okay, it gives us information about that organism's digestive system. Okay, it might not tell us too much about the mineral content of what it ate, but it could tell us things like, oh, was it a vegetarian? Was it a herbivore, etc.? Is it a carnivore or an omnivore? Just by the shape and the size of the feces. And then finally, if you have organisms that have been trapped in amber, okay, which is basically just a plant resin or syrup, or even tar, that is probably the best kind of fossil because this type of fossil often traps DNA, okay, like that we can extract from their cells and tissues. Okay. Most of the times when we find fossils, we tend to use a process called radiocarbon dating to figure out how old that fossil is. So this is a procedure that can determine the precise age of a fossil. And all they do is they basically figure out how much carbon remains in this fossil compared to what it should have, okay, if it were fossilized today. So if we look at this as an example here, let's say you had a log that is currently fossilized today, okay, it would have 100% of its expected carbon. So we consider this to be age 0. Now, when it gets down to 50% carbon that's left, a certain amount of time has passed. So in this example, they say that it's age 5,730 years. And then by the time there's only 25% carbon left, carbon 14, even more time has passed. Okay, so in this case, 11,460 years. Okay, so by figuring out how much carbon is left, we can figure out how old or how much time has passed. All right, so this section here is the second piece of evidence. This is actually quite a long section, but I'll do my best to go through it as clearly as I can. So, anatomy and physiology. Anatomy refers to how the body is structured. Physiology refers to the function of those structures. And if we're comparing them between different organisms. Okay. So we've noticed upon comparison that similar structures provide evidence that organisms came from an earlier common ancestor. So there are three types of structures that are useful in supporting evolution. The first of those structures is called homologous structures. Simply put, these are structures that have similar anatomy but different functions. So for example, there are 6 organisms here: a bird, a bat, a whale, a cat, a horse, and a human. We're looking at the arms or legs of these individuals, okay, of these different species. And what we can see is that their anatomy is very similar to each other. Okay? As a matter of fact, they're showcasing 5 sets of bones, okay, 5 specific groups of bones. And they're all shaded in different colors. So they have, each of them, the exact same type of bones, but they're orientated, like the length and the size, okay, are a little bit different, okay, but they're still kind of structured in the same way. However, each of these limbs perform a different kind of function. So for example, the limb of a bat is designed to fly, okay, just like a bird's, but the limb of a whale is designed for swimming. Whereas cats and horses, and even humans, okay, our limbs are designed for other types of movement, okay, on land. Whereas humans, we have, a distinction between arms and legs, but our human arms allows us to grab onto things, to reach for things, okay, to move things around. So they all have different functions, but similar structures or anatomy. These 5 bones are basically called, or they make up what we call the pendactyl limb. Okay, so pent is the prefix for 5, like pentagon, 5 sides. Okay, so the pendactyl limb basically refers to the forearms of mammals. This suggests that anyone that has a pendactyl limb, they must have shared a same common ancestor at some point in time. Usually these structures are modified for a specific function, like I mentioned earlier with a whale's fin for swimming and a bird wing for flying. Different function, similar structure. Okay. So these 5 bones structures is a good evidence, okay, that animals can change over time. Okay, considering that it's the belief that we all came from the same common ancestor, that's probably why we share these similar structures, even though over time they've been modified for different functions. Number 2, analogous structures. This is almost the opposite of homologous structures. Okay, in this case, animals have different anatomies, okay, but whatever their limb structures are, they show the same function. So to give you an example here, if we compare an insect wing with either a bird's wing or a bat wing, okay, insects' wings are very different in structure from bat wings. Okay. Bat wings have bone, they have membranes and tissues, whereas insect wings, if you remember from our earlier biodiversity lessons, insect wings are actually just an outgrowth of the exoskeleton. So they're only made from chitin, okay, which is a completely different material, and the structures are completely different. But the end result is that because of these analogous structures, all these animals can fly. So they have the same function. They're used for the same purpose. So even if 2 organisms don't share a common ancestor, so in this case a bat or a bird versus an insect, they don't really have a direct common ancestor. Okay, you have to go very far back into their evolutionary lineage in order to find a common ancestor. So even though they don't share a direct common ancestor, because of their environment, okay, that they're in, if they're both similar environment, they can still separately evolve similar characteristics. So in this case, the characteristic that they have evolved is the ability to fly. So this again supports the idea that organisms change over time. Most of the time, creationists will believe that organisms cannot change over time like this. So any evidence that we have that shows organisms changing over a long period of time is a good piece of evidence to support evolution. Okay. The last type of structure that we'll talk about in this video is called a vestigial structure. Okay. So again, comparing different types of organisms, okay, we find that vestigial structures is a type of homologous structure, but they don't serve a purpose or a function anymore. So they no longer have a purpose. So if you think about this, humans have many different traits or structures on their bodies or inside their bodies that we don't use. Okay? Now, the first example I'll give you, it's not from a human, but it is from a mammal. Okay, so in this case, a whale. Now, this also occurs in snakes, which are reptiles. Okay, but neither of them have legs. Okay, so a whale doesn't have legs, snakes don't have legs. However, when you look at their skeletons, they still have a femur, which is the longest leg bone in the body, as well as a pelvis. So if they never had legs, why do they have these bones? Okay, so this suggests that at some point, both snakes and whales must have had limbs, okay, or legs, and then they've lost those limbs and legs. Okay, and right now, their femur and pelvis is all that remains. But their femur and pelvis, they don't have a purpose. Okay, because there's no legs, they don't function. So right now, we're taking a very specific snapshot in time, and we can see that at this moment, even though they don't have legs, their pelvis and femurs are becoming smaller and reduced. Now, for humans, this would be our appendix. At one point, our appendix does have a function, okay, especially in cows. This particular structure would help to digest cellulose. But since humans are omnivores, okay, we can eat plants and meat, okay, over time, our appendix stopped working. Okay, it's no longer has a function or serving its purpose. So maybe in the next million years, humans might be born without an appendix. Okay. So, as evidence of evolution, vestigial structures indicate that organisms can change through time. Okay, but they also prove that the environment has an influence as well. Okay, so it suggests that the function of a structure is actually linked or connected to its environment. So just to give you some examples of other vestigial structures, sex organs of dandelions. Okay, these are vestigial. Dandelions don't use their stamen and pistil to reproduce anymore. They found a more efficient way of just releasing their seeds. Human wisdom teeth. Okay, these are the third set of molars that some humans actually have. Again, they're not that useful, considering that we don't lose our adult molars until we're very old. Okay, so human wisdom teeth that are pretty much popping out right about now for you guys around your age. Okay, they're just actually in the way. They're more of a hindrance than anything else. So they're considered to be vestigial as well, including the human tailbone and the eyes of most deep water fish. Okay, if you're down that deep where there's no sunlight, you probably won't need to expend energy making eyes that can help you to see. So if that's the case, most of those fish that live in deep water, they're basically blind. Okay, so their eyes are now vestigial structures. And then of course the wings of flightless birds. Okay, so things like ostriches, okay, because their body mass is so large, they really can't use their wings to gain any lift or thrust, so they can't fly. So they are also vestigial structures. All right, that's it for this video here. Please tune in next time for part 2, where we will go through everything from embryological evidence to biochemical evidence and finally biogeographical evidence. Thank you. See you guys.